constitutional amendment. It could eradicate slavery, but obviously it could not eradicate racism, right? And in many ways, at the end of the Civil War, racism burrowed down even more deeply because of the revenge and the hatred that many Southerners felt over having lost the war, their humiliation, etc. Federal troops were stationed in the South from 1865 to 1877 to guarantee that slavery as an institution would not be reconstituted. Slaves were offered as reparations. 40 acres and a mule to be given to any family of four of the former slave population. Now, I think we would all agree that if you kick somebody and you keep kicking them, you morally owe it to them to do more than to stop kicking. You morally owe it to them to say, here, let me help you get back up. 40 acres and a mule would have allowed a now free population to then be integrated economically into the condition of freedom. I mean, think about it. One thing those slaves, former slaves had was major skill sets because they'd been doing all the work. So 40 acres and a mule would have allowed them to have a chance to go on with their lives. In most cases, the 40 acres and a mule was not given. Even in the cases where it was, in most cases, it was then taken away. So that, as Martin Luther King Jr. later said, they were freed, but what were they freed to? Southern legislatures, as soon as the federal troops left, passed what were called Black Code laws. Black Code laws were passed to ensure subpar economic, social, and political rights and participation of the former slave population. Now, this is something, you know, we need a whole person politics. We need an integrated politics. So I'm asking you to really listen, just like with these children, to really take in what it means that those millions of American children live in chronic trauma. Please listen with your heart and think about what this means. You've got 2.5 centuries of slavery. First, slaves brought over in the 1600s. It really revs up in the beginning of the 1800s with the cotton industry. And then at the end of slavery, at the end of the Civil War, there were anywhere between 4 and 5 million slaves. But what followed was 100 years of another kind of violence. The fact that it wasn't slavery, it was still violence. It was the Black Code laws, Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, Jim Crow, lynchings. By 1900, full-on institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, which was not challenged until the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So you're talking about the 1860s to the 1960s. What Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement achieved is extraordinary. And nothing that I'm talking about is to diminish or minimize the sacrifices, the struggles, or the successes of any of our ancestors, black or white. However, what the Civil Rights Act did, it dismantled many of the externalized conditions of segregation, such as sitting at the lunch counter, discrimination in hiring, etc. And then the next year, in '65, there was the Voting Rights Act, which ensured that they would have equal participation in voting. However, it did not address the fact of the economic integration of the descendants of slaves that still was at that time and still today resulting in a gap between the white population and the black population being equal in terms of economic opportunity. The fact that if you're an Oprah Winfrey or a Magic Johnson or Tyler Perry, you can make it. The fact that if you're a brilliant, amazing genius in America, you can make it no matter who you are, is wonderful, but that of itself is not social justice. And it is also worth noting that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, starting in 2013, under the John Roberts corporatist Supreme Court, has now started chipping away at the Voting Rights Act, which is why we have all these voter suppression efforts all around the country aimed mainly at people of color and disenfranchised communities. It's back What we're talking about is the fact that when it comes to race relations, in many ways, ladies and gentlemen, in our time, we're sliding backwards. Mass incarceration, sliding backwards. Racial disparity in criminal sentencing, sliding backwards. Voting suppression efforts, sliding backwards. Since 1945, since the Second World War, Germany has paid $89 billion in reparations to Jewish organizations. Now, Germany can't make the Holocaust not have happened, but those reparations paid to Jewish organizations has gone a long way towards reconciliation between the German people and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave to all people who had been interned in the Japanese internment camps. That was about 120,000 people who were interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. All those who were still living in 1988 got between $20,000 and $22,000. We should pay reparations for slavery.
Woo-hoo!
Faulkner said the past is over. In fact, it's not even past. You can't put a number, you can't put a dollar. You can't measure human life and human suffering that extreme monetarily, but you can come to a number that is big enough and a number that is fundamentally serious enough that given to a council of black leaders in America could be dispersed over, let's say, 10 years, and could be at according to their own decisions, dispersed to economic and educational projects, which they feel begins to close the gap or give a real chance at closing that gap that still exists economically as a result of the original sin of slavery, an economic recompense and restitution that has not been addressed since 1865. There are a lot of people, Tom Hesse Coates, Sandy Darity, and others who have worked on this. Anything less than $100 million is an insult. Obviously, you know, it could go up to $200 billion, $500 billion, whatever it is. Given over 20 years, I remind you that we spent $718 billion this year alone on our military spending. And that's the last thing I'd like to talk to you about. Just like our economic system has absolutely nothing to do with long-term economic planning, our national security agenda has nothing to do with planning for peace on earth. We prepare